welcome to the Convex Conversation with me, broadcaster Helen Fospero. Many years ago, the nation was gripped by the unfolding, shocking story of serial murderers Fred and Rose West, a seemingly ordinary couple from Gloucester. As a young TV journalist, I covered the breaking news at 25 Cromwell Street, known as the House of Horrors, as police dug up their garden, searching for bodies. Also at the scene in the mid-90s was Sunday Mirror reporter Howard Sounes, credited with breaking the story. Howard went on to write what is considered the definitive story of the depraved couple who preyed on, tortured and killed vulnerable young girls and women and didn't stop at their own children. It's thought they killed at least 12. Recently, Howard got access to more than 100 hours of police interviews with Fred West, who took his own life in prison awaiting trial. The material was revelatory and led to Howard writing the Fred West tapes, Secrets of the Fred and Rose Murder Investigation, and producing an incredible Netflix series watched by a worldwide audience of more than 100 million.
I have told you the whole truth about these matters.
Is there anything else, Fred? We'll find it.
You find her, and I'll be happy.
Howard is a highly respected biographer, featuring notable figures like Bob Dylan, Sir Paul McCartney and Lou Reed. He's also written in depth about Moore's murderer Myra Hindley and prolific underground writer Charles Bukowski, who used his poetry and prose to depict the depravity of urban life in American society. And I'm delighted to say he's here in the Convex Conversation studio. Howard, who would have thought all these, not years, all these decades on from Cromwell Street, we'd be recording a podcast about the extraordinary body of work that you've gone on to do?
Well, it's lovely to see you, Helen, and I'm really honoured to be asked.
When we were in our early reporting days and you were working for the paper, did you have any aspirations to become a biographer?
Yeah, I did. I always wanted to be a writer from when I was a child, and I actually wanted to be a biographer. When I was a little boy, I tried to write a biography of one of my heroes, who was Winston Churchill. And then, oddly enough, I did become that very thing, yeah.
Gosh, that's unusual, isn't it, as a young boy to want to be a biographer?
It is. I was obsessed with Winston Churchill, and I remember sitting in my bedroom, mostly drawing pictures of Winston Churchill, copied from books, but then writing bits of text, which I copied out of other books. And I did see myself as writing this book about Winston Churchill when I was at primary school, which is a slightly odd thing to have done.
Gosh, and interesting as well to be as fascinated with Churchill at such a tender age. What do you think it was about Churchill that you were fascinated by as a little lad?
As a child, it was really because it was about the war. And like all little boys, I was mad on guns, planes, tanks and war films. And of course, growing up in the 60s and 70s, we were still in the aftermath of the Second World War. But actually, to this day, Churchill's one of my great heroes, and he's such a fascinating, complicated and lovable character. And I think of all the people in the world, in a fantasy dinner party, I would love to have met Winston Churchill. Although he's now, people have issues with Churchill. Personally, I have no issues. I just love him and admire him and feel complete warmth and affection for him.
And you've written all these different books, but as far as I'm aware, you haven't written anything on Churchill, have you?
I've tried.
Have you?
I've tried, yeah. And funny, my agent is the agent for the Churchill estate. But I've never quite got it together. And it may happen, but yeah, my great heroes really are actually Churchill, Picasso and Bob Dylan. So of the three, I've written one. But the thing is, there's so much about Churchill, there's so much about Picasso, there's so much about Bob Dylan. You're competing with hundreds of other books and the whole history is immense. And to do something new is difficult.
It's very difficult, isn't it? So in those days of early career stages, you became a Fleet Street journalist. What led you down the Fleet Street and the news path?
Well, I wanted to be a writer, but of course it's very difficult to make your living as a writer. And so my granddad saw an ad in the local paper saying reporter wanted. And he said, well, you want to be a writer, why don't you become a reporter? And of course, you can make your living as a reporter more easily than being an author. And I applied for this job, got it, and suddenly I was a reporter at 19. And one thing led to another, really. And before I knew it, I was in Fleet Street. I enjoyed it as a young man because it's fun. Being a reporter is fun when you're young, isn't it? It's a fun way of seeing the world and travelling and being part of history to some extent. But I got a bit tired of it. But I enjoyed it in my 20s.
And of course, writing biographies is so different to writing articles for newspapers. I'm guessing that you really love digging deep and doing forensic research when you're writing about people's lives. Do you think, is that the side that you were yearning for? Yes, you were writing for newspapers, but it's quite surface, isn't it, next to the kind of work you do now and that you'd aspired to do?
Well, I'm a bit of a loner and I'm not a great team player, which is a problem because I also now work in television, but I like to be in charge of my own destiny. I like to set my own agenda. I don't like being told what to do. And I got tired of the formulaic nature of tabloid journalism. And I'm much happier if I'm on my own in a room with my own project, which I can fulfill to my own best ability. I don't want anyone interfering. And so it suits my personality. Most journalists I've known in my career don't have that sort of personality. They have more of a jumping from one thing to the other, you know. Most journalists like to do things and move on to the next thing. They like to do a story, finish it today and do another story tomorrow. But I prefer to take one subject and spend a year or 2 years or even 3 years on it. And that horrifies some journalists because it seems mad. But I would prefer to spend that time on one thing and do it really as well as you possibly can than do lots of little things.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because we mentioned Fred and Rose in the introduction, and that was your story, and you broke it, and I'll find out how in a moment. But then that also not only led you into writing, but it led you to be in your study with 100 hours or more of Fred West interviews. You couldn't get more solitary than that, and presumably quite dark, Howard, sitting there listening to a serial murderer and being completely in charge of what you did with that material.
Yeah. Fred and Rose has been an odd one because I've been lucky with Fred and Rose West. I've become kind of the Fred and Rose West guy, and I've made, dare I say it, quite a lot of money out of it over the years. And I've made lots of projects, 2 books, 3 or 4 TV shows, podcasts, a Netflix series. And of course, the more you do something, the deeper you get into it. And then you find at some point you can't really get out of it. It's like a relationship. You get so deep into it, you can never really find your way out. And to some extent, you can't leave it behind, even if you wanted to. I have mixed feelings about it now. You always want to do something else. You don't want to just do the one thing, but it has been very good to me. It is a very dark subject, but it is possible to separate the grisly details of murder from the studying what is psychologically and sociologically, to use fancy words, a very interesting phenomenon, a very odd, unusual person in a time and a place. If you study it from that point of view, it's endlessly fascinating.
For those people who are perhaps too young to remember Fred and Rose West, obviously we know a lot about it because we were there at the time and we remember it. Will you just remind us of the bare bones, she says that's an unfortunate phrase to use, of the story that horrified the nation from day one and how you broke this story?
Well, I was just a jobbing news reporter for the Mirror, covering everything from the Duchess of York, Fergie, trips to New York to Elton John, anything that is tabloidy, train crash, plane crash, showbiz stories, in a cab rank sort of system, whatever came up, whatever the news editor said, do this, go here, do this, cover this, whatever it is, go to court, go to the Old Bailey. Anyway, one day I'm in the office and the phone rings and it's a source calling from Gloucester saying, you know about this murder story that was ongoing, it just started. Well, it's much bigger than you know. There's not just 3 bodies, there's 12 bodies and they're walled up in the house, like an Edgar Allan Poe type story. House full of bodies, bricked up under the floor, behind the fireplace, under the bathroom floor. It's a house of horrors. And, well, a colleague and I, we started to write the story as a front page story. We came up with this phrase, the House of Horrors. And that's the front page. So we break the story of there being 12 bodies in the House of Horrors. There's 9 in the house and there's 3 in the house around the corner. And these properties are linked to a couple called Fred and Rose West. And Fred and Rose West are kind of working class people in Gloucester. And they have kids, a big family. And it turns out they've been killing their own children and lodgers and their sex crimes. And it's been going on since the 60s. And it's all unraveled because the police have realized that one of the kids is missing and they've got a warrant to dig up the back garden. And sure enough, she's in the back garden, Heather, the 16-year-old daughter. But in the process of finding Heather's bones, they stumble upon other bones and then they realize this house is full of bones. And so it's an amazing story. And it was immediately apparent to me, as it would be to any journalist really, that this was an exceptional crime story. It wasn't an everyday crime story. It was one of those that comes along every 10 years or so. that is just endlessly interesting and has all sorts of implications. And it had all sorts of potential. And that led me to write my first book, which was Fred and Rose.
And your first book was it was a bestseller. I mean, it did really well. It was best-selling in the crime charts as well. What compelled you to write it? What was it about that story, Howard, that you thought, actually, this is it. This is where I can just get my head down and get it on paper? Because it didn't take you very long. It came out very quickly, didn't it? Really, after the story broke.
Yeah, I had an inside source. So I had inside information from the start. And I had too much information that we couldn't use all the information I had. There wasn't space in the Mirror for it. And also, we had a sub judice issue because Fred was arrested and Rose was arrested and there was going to be a trial. So I had all this information which I couldn't actually use. And I fairly quickly dawned upon me that this was a book and I should go off and write the book. And I had an agent because I'd previously tried to write a book. And I had a very good agent, and I still have the same agent all these years later, one of the best in the country. And I sent them a proposal and they sold it. And suddenly I was an author. I was suddenly an author and I had this project. But the thing is, I realized that I had an opportunity there to change my life. And if I really, really worked hard, if I gave it everything, if I wrote a really good crime book, I aspired to write a book as good as In Cold Blood or The Executioner's Song by Norman Mailer. If I wrote a book of that standard, or I aspired to do that, then I could have a new career. I saw it as a way out of journalism, but I had to do it to the highest possible level. And I had to eschew all the bad habits of journalism, hyperbole, exaggerating quotes, all the things I'd done as a reporter, frankly. All of that was behind me. Everything was going to be verbatim. Nobody was going to be misquoted. Nothing was going to be exaggerated. I wasn't going to speculate. I was going to be an absolutely scrupulous chronicler of this case. I would work day and night, and I worked day and night all weekends in my flat in Hackney. My girlfriend said, why can't we go out? And I said, no, I've got to write my book. And she was cross with me. Everyone was cross with me. I neglected my job. And I didn't cut the grass for a year, so the grass got that high. Suddenly I looked outside the window, and the grass was as high as an elephant's eye, literally. But it was a bestseller, and suddenly I was a writer, and it made money. And also, more importantly, I could then write another book. And that was a life-changing experience.
We'll get on to your other book in a second, but you explored every aspect of their lives. I suppose it didn't come as much of a shock to you, Howard, when you looked into both Fred and Rose's childhoods and realised how troubled and not normal they were. You went into some incredible depths, didn't you?
Well, yeah. So I think with all interesting people, and they don't have to be murderers, anyone who's interesting, anyone who's exceptional in a good way or a bad way, they have an interesting backstory. You don't get to be exceptional by coming from a normal background. There's something in the background that makes you exceptional. And Fred and Rose had very troubled backgrounds where incest and abuse was commonplace, and they grew up in this perverted world which shaped them. And one of the reasons why Fred and Rose is such a successful book, I think, is that rather than just focus on the murders, the first 6 or 7 chapters, the first 200 pages perhaps, is the backstory. It's their grandparents and how they grew up and how they met and their early life. And so you have this feeling of 1950s Britain, 1960s Britain, a vanished world, really. Fred's country childhood, Rose's childhood, how they met. And before you get to the murders, and the murders don't happen in the book until maybe, I don't know, halfway in or something, or maybe even 2/3 of the way in. But by then you've got to know Fred and Rose as people. And of course they are people. They're often referred to as monsters, but they're not monsters. It's a man and a woman like we are. They went to Marks and Spencer's and they had children and they had a mortgage, and they were, on one level, they were people. They aren't supernatural. They aren't evil. They are perverse and they are wicked. But they are also people, and you can't begin to understand them unless you look at them on that level, really. They went to school and they had parents, and at one point they were babies, little babies playing with bricks. And somehow what happened between then and being sadistic torturers of innocent people? I mean, how did that happen? That's the journey that you're going on.
We'll come back to Fred because he is the subject of what has been a highly successful Netflix documentary series for you. But you said there that that book changed your life. How did it change your life, and how did the transition come from Fleet Street journalist to hanging up your typewriter, if you can hang up a typewriter, and being a full-time writer?
So I wanted to write another book. My publisher immediately, my agent said to me, what's your next book? because you've written a successful book, you've made us money, you've made yourself money, everyone's happy. What's the next book? Expecting I was going to write another murder book. And I didn't want to write another murder book. I wanted to get away from that. I wanted to write a more prestigious biography of someone I admired. And it just so happened that recently I've been reading the works of an American author called Charles Bukowski, who wrote about his experience of being a working class man, a poet in Los Angeles, working for the Postal Service. He was an alcoholic, and he wrote this sort of, it's quite close to Jack Kerouac and people like that, sort of beat writers, but he wasn't part of that group. It's a niche interest of mine. And I really empathise with Bukowski, who hated his job in the post office. I had come to hate my job at the Mirror. Bukowski hated being told what to do. I hated being told what to do. I was sitting in my Mirror car in Birmingham one day, reading Bukowski and waiting for somebody, I don't know who it was. And I thought, oh, I'm fed up with this. I'm absolutely fed up with this life and got to change my career now. And I thought, well, I'll write a Bukowski biography. And again, I sold it, and I got a New York publisher called Grove Press. And Grove Press, as you may know, has published some of the greatest writers. They published Samuel Beckett, they published Norman Mailer, they published Jack Kerouac, they published William Burroughs, and suddenly they're publishing me. And I got this call. I was in the supermarket. I got the call from my agent saying, Grove Press want to buy your book. And I thought, Jesus, Grove Press are going to publish me? And I was so excited. I thought, well, this is it. This is the big break. This is my break. And Bukowski knew people like Norman Mailer and Allen Ginsberg. And suddenly I'm corresponding with Norman Mailer and Allen Ginsberg, and I'm interviewing them. And I'm going to New York to meet people. And I'm meeting my new New York agent. And I thought, well, this is my life now. And then meanwhile, I'm working for the Mirror, and I'm starting to really hate working for the Mirror. I really, really resent it, and I'm not doing the job properly. And I made a few mistakes. I got told off by the editor, who was Piers Morgan. He started to get a bit fed up with me. Lots of things happened. But one day they rang up and said, Howard, there's a murder in the Lake District. There's a body in Lake Windermere. Go to Lake Windermere. And I lived in Hackney. And I said, well, okay, if I go to Lake Windermere, it's a Friday. I'm not coming back until next week, am I? But it's my long weekend, and I've got my book to write. And they said, well, the editor doesn't care. He wants you to go to Lake Windermere because you're a murder guy, right? You're the Fred and Rose guy. And I said, well, I'm not going because I'm writing about Charles Bukowski this weekend. And they said, well, you've got to go. And I said, well, I quit. And they said, do you mean it? And I said, I mean it. And they said, well, you better put it in writing. So I sat down at my manual typewriter and I wrote, Dear Piers, I quit. Howard Sounes, best wishes. Then I went round the corner to the paper shop and I faxed it. This is 1997. Then I went home. I hadn't even had breakfast yet. This was like 9 o'clock in the morning on a Friday in the middle of summer. And I suddenly realized I was unemployed. I'd lost my job. I just quit. I had no payoff. I had to give the car back. I had to give the phone back, my pension. And I was on my own. And I thought, oh my God, this is a mad thing I've just done. And I thought that they were going to ring me up and ask me to come back. But of course they didn't.
And they didn't.
They were quite happy for me to go.
And looking back, with the benefit of hindsight, I bet you're really glad you quit at that point, aren't you?
Well, it was very painful, actually. It was difficult to adjust from having that regular paycheck to suddenly I was a self-employed author writing about a poet. This is mad. And it was difficult and it was quite stressful, and I was very worried about money, and I was really anxious and slightly screwed up about money. Can I afford to pay the bills? It wasn't planned. It was just a moment of losing my temper, actually, on the phone. But if I hadn't done it, I probably wouldn't have had the career I've had. I would have probably ended up spending longer in Fleet Street than I should have done.
And of course, your aim from being a little boy was to always be a writer. And there you are, being a writer. The title of the book, Charles Bukowski, Locked in the Arms of a Crazy Life. I got to be really honest with you, Howard. I don't really know much about him at all. But what kind of work did you do? What kind of book did you produce on Bukowski?
Bukowski had just died when I wrote the book, and it's the life of Charles Bukowski. Bukowski wrote about his own life in his work. His work is autobiographical, but he tended to exaggerate the story of his life. And so the point of that book is to separate the reality from the imagined biography that he created. He wrote about himself in the guise of this character called Henry Chinaski. So there's a character called Chinaski, who's the hero of his books, and there is Charles Bukowski, the real man. And my method was to separate the two and show the reader who he really was. And by dint of interviewing all his friends, his girlfriends, his wives, his fellow writers, his work colleagues, almost all of whom were in Los Angeles. And it was a successful book, and it's still a successful book, and it got very good reviews. And it was enough to, again, my agent and publisher say, well, what do you want to do next? But it was never going to make me a lot of money. I mean, it did make money, actually. And it was a very good experience. It's my best book. It's the book I'm proudest of. It's the one that was closest to what I set out to achieve, really. And I think of all my books, it's the one I'm happiest with.
And how did you really come across him in the first place?
Oh, I'm a voracious reader, and I'm a reader of literature, and I read everything, and I've read every book you can imagine, including Bukowski. And I just like the fact that he wrote very simple prose. He was funny. He's very funny. And I like the fact he was an outsider who didn't fit into society. And I saw a little bit of myself in that. And I particularly liked the way he hated his job, and I disliked my job. And he didn't like being told what to do. He was always trying to get away from his job at the post office in Los Angeles to go home and write. And I was always trying to get away from my job for the Mirror and go home and write. And in that sense, we kind of met sort of psychologically. And he drank a great deal. And in those days, I used to try to sort of inhabit the characters I wrote about. So I also drank a great deal. And he had this terrible diet, and I copied his diet. And so I kind of lived his life for a couple of years, which wasn't very healthy. But I've done that with several things. When I wrote about Paul McCartney, I learned to play the guitar. When I wrote about Tiger Woods, I learned to play golf, because it helps you think about what you're doing.
It's almost like method acting, I suppose, as an actor, isn't it?
It really does help. Even if you just swing a golf club a couple of times a week, it helps you just write those paragraphs about Tiger Woods winning the Masters. If you've held a golf club and you've hit a ball into a hole, it does help.
Let's just hope you didn't get into any of Fred West's habits.
No.
It's funny, isn't it, Howard, that all these years later, you then got back into the whole Fred West story, because you got a phone call, didn't you, from a contact offering you, I think it was more than 100 hours of tape recordings of Fred being interviewed by detectives. How did that come about? And when you got that call, what was your thought process like at that point?
I still have all those journalistic instincts whereby I know what sells and I know what makes a podcast or a TV show or a book. You just know. You do it for 40 years. You just know it when you see it. And so I had this contact. And I was always aware that there were these Fred West police interviews, of course, and they were recorded. Of course they were recorded. But one of my contacts said he had these tapes in a laundry bag in his basement. And they'd been there for 30 years. And he didn't know what to do with them. And so we started to talk about it. And it wasn't an easy process. There were issues, legal issues, let's say, financial issues. But one day we met and we found one of these tapes, which hadn't been played for 30 years. They were analog tapes, old-fashioned cassette tapes. And we found an old-fashioned cassette player somewhere in this house, like a kid's Walkman. From itself was like a 20-year-old thing, which hardly worked. We put some batteries in it and we chunked a tape in. And suddenly there was Fred West. Yeah. And I work in television. I said to a colleague of mine who I work with, I said, well, look, I think this is a project, but I want a certain amount of money for this. And we sold it to Netflix.
That's incredible. What was it like being locked in your study, listening to all that, hours and hours of stuff?
Well, it was fascinating because I'd written the Fred West book and I'd lived with this case for many years. I sat through the trial for 6 weeks every day, and I'd been deeply immersed in the story for many, many years. I knew lots of the people involved, the characters, the families, the police. Suddenly I had Fred's voice in my head, and I was the guy who firstly actually transcribed and digitized these tapes, which took months on my own in my study at home in the Barbican in London where I live. And it was the summer. I started in the summer. It was beautiful outside. The sky was blue and the trees were swaying, and Barbican's lovely. It's all very civilized. And suddenly I had Fred's voice in my head talking about murder and rape and dismemberment and all sorts of disgusting sexual things, because he was a sex maniac. And it was appalling, but also fascinating, not least because simply by dint of listening to all those hours of somebody talking, you get to learn their speech patterns and the words they repeat, the phrases they repeat, the lies they tell, the things they avoid talking about, the things they like to talk about. And that's very revealing of somebody's character and personality. And I really felt I got to know Fred as I hadn't known him previously. And again, I had that feeling, which is just an instinctual feeling you have. This is a book. Not only is it a Netflix series, as it turned out, it's also a book, because it's just so rich in material. There's so much there, really. There's so much there you can't even use all of it, you know? Even with the Netflix thing and the book I've just done, Fred West tapes, we only use maybe 10% of it.
Is there an example of something that you remember Fred's voice saying that was revelatory?
Well, his childhood is fascinating. The way he talks in this very distinctive way. He drops his H's, so he says Ether and Herefordshire, and he talks like he's already got a very gruff voice. But he's not an unpleasant voice. He doesn't swear. He doesn't lose his temper. He's quite calm. He talks like a countryman, and he talks about his childhood. I found the details of his childhood most interesting, about growing up in the country, just growing up in this little cottage in the country with no running water, a pig in the back garden, and there's a world there that suddenly comes alive. And it's a world that's, on the surface, quite attractive, a sort of bucolic childhood in 1950s England. And yet, suddenly you see hints of things that are a bit odd, sexual things. His attitude to sex is very odd, and it emerges slowly. And then he'll suddenly start talking about a murder in the most explicit way that is the most horrifying thing you've ever heard in your life. And of course, after a while, you stop being shocked by this. But the first time you hear it, it is shocking.
What were the challenges of working on the Netflix documentary? Something most of us, including myself, dream about. But you were producing a series which was based on audio recordings. So I would imagine that in itself took a lot of thought, did it?
Yeah, and we also got the video in the end. So if you watch the Netflix series Fred and Rose West, A British Horror Story, not only do we have those audio recordings, but we also have the video, the police video of the murder investigation, i.e. Fred at the scene. Because when he was taken back to the scene, they videoed him. And then we had all these amazing contributors. I got Brian Leveson to do it. He'd never done it before, Sir Brian Leveson. He was the prosecutor. And of course, Sir Brian Leveson's an extremely important guy in the world of law. So we had a great cast of contributors. I'm not a great team player, but unfortunately you can't make a TV series on your own. Maybe you can, but in my experience, you have to work with other people who you end up hating. Not all of them, but it's a process of egos and budgets, and everyone wants to be in charge. And there's a lot of politics in making any television program. I'm not talking about Netflix, any television program. There's lots of politics and personalities involved. But I think actually it is a good series, and it's certainly very successful.
Didn't you even build a ginormous tape recorder machine?
Well, all credit to the director. He had to visualize all this stuff. You can't just play 100 hours of tape. You can only play little bits. And it soon is visually boring, so you have to find a way to represent it. So we commissioned a giant tape recorder, which I think cost £20,000 or something. And it was basically a gigantic exploded version of a little cassette player, which you could then get cameras inside and you could light. So if you watch the series, you'll see these spools turning. But to actually make that work, the thing was about as big as a piano. And somebody had to make that at great expense.
When you watched it go out, Howard, or you saw the final cut, did you feel really proud of it? Because I know it took an awful lot of work. And as you say, it put you out of your comfort zone in that you do prefer doing your own thing. There's a huge team always involved in big TV things like that. But did you feel proud and that you'd really done the story justice?
Not so much, because it's not so much me. It's like I'm part of a team. And it was a good deal, and I'm happy that it worked out. But it's not like it's my own work. When I wrote the book is my own work. And I feel much more personally connected to a book than a TV program. Because who's to say who has the final thumbprint on a TV program? Ultimately, you're working for the broadcaster. And that's the truth. The difference between doing that and writing books is that basically the book is your brain. That is you. You are the book. I've never felt that about a TV program.
No, I suppose though, but it's you that had that contact, that had those tapes for 30 years in a laundry bag. And without you, that project would never have seen the light of day, I don't think.
No, that's true, yeah. And a lot of people were employed as a result. It's one of those things that worked out well. It took a long time. It wasn't easy. It didn't happen overnight. It took years, actually, to come to fruition.
I'm glad it did. It was a fascinating watch. Now, Down the Highway, The Life of Bob Dylan was also a massive success for you and is seen as one of the finest Dylan biographies. I know a lot of people who love Dylan and would hold your book up there as one of the finest. So much has been written about him. How did you choose Bob Dylan as the subject of another biographical book?
Well, that was my third book. I'd written this Bukowski book, and I really needed to write a book that was going to be commercially more successful. And I had lunch with the publisher, and he said, well, Dylan's going to be 60. This was about 1998. He's going to be 60 soon. You should do a book for his 60th birthday. That's going to be a big deal. And you loved Dylan. I'd loved him from when I was 15. I'd been to see all the concerts. I'd read all the books. He was one of my great heroes, along with Picasso and Winston Churchill. And my publisher felt the same. Some people just love Dylan, and I'm one of them. And I thought, oh, this is a good idea. And so I started researching it. And I did about 6 months of research before we sold it. And we sold it again to Grove. Grove in New York bought it. And they paid the biggest advance I've ever had for a book, a big 6-figure advance in dollars. When my agent told me, I swore. I was so surprised. I was in the bath. I wrote the number on the wall of the bath. I couldn't believe this number, this 6-figure number, which was a big number. And it was enough to do it properly. Why that matters for several reasons. One, it means you can actually research it properly. You can go to America, you can travel backwards and forwards, stay in hotels, hire the cars, get the planes, stay in Los Angeles for 6 weeks if you have to, in one hotel, all of which you have to do to find stuff and to get to people. All of that is very difficult, to persuade people to talk to you and find out new stuff. Because you're competing with all the other books that have been written, you've got to do something better. You've got to go beyond all of that stuff and do something that's new and revelatory and true. And that's very, very hard to do. And that takes time and hard work. And it does take some money, some financing.
And how did you achieve that with Dylan? How did you find new stuff and stuff that was revelatory?
Well, my big coup with Dylan, there's lots of new things in it, but the big coup with Dylan was this story about his second secret marriage. Everyone knew about his first marriage, which is to a lady called Sarah, who's well known. But then there were rumors that he'd be married again. And Dylan's a very secretive guy. He's a mysterious, secretive, slightly cranky character. He's not someone who likes to talk about his personal life. And so one heard rumors that he'd be married again, but no one knew about it. Every time I interviewed somebody, I said, well, what about Bob's second marriage? And then I finally got a name. And then I was in Los Angeles, staying in this hotel for many weeks. And I went downtown to the public records office. And I started going through the records, through the marriage records, until I found it, until I found the marriage record. And then I paid $10 for it. And then I had a scoop because I knew the name and I had the marriage certificate. And luckily in Los Angeles, these things are public if you can find them. And he'd been married and divorced and had a child, and no one knew about it. No one knew the name. It had never been published. And yet he'd had all this big part of his life had happened. Very important. Any marriage is important in anyone's life, obviously, and to have a child, etc. And so that became a scoop in the book, and it became part of the way the book was sold. It was a front-page story around the world. And it helped make the book a bestseller. But actually, in terms of the 600-page book, it's only one page. But it helps. It just helps leverage interest in the project. And there's lots of things like that in the book, but that is the one that really got the headlines at the time.
And you interviewed lots of his close associates, didn't you?
Yeah, and his family, actually. I sat down with his children in Beverly Hills one day. I was very surprised they did that, but that was really helpful. And Bob Weir of the Grateful Dead just died the other day, and Bob Weir invited me to meet him in San Francisco, and he told me a great story about Bob wanting to join the Grateful Dead, which, if you know anything about Bob Dylan and Grateful, it's a totally bizarre idea. But Bob wanted to join the Grateful Dead as a band member, and they took a vote on it, and they voted against it.
Oh, did they really?
Yeah, and I thought that was just a great story. So that's another good story in the book. Bob told me this story on the basis that I didn't say who vetoed it. But now that Bob and the vetoer are now both dead, I can say it was Phil Lesh. And if you know anything about the Grateful Dead, Phil Lesh was one of the guitar players in the Grateful Dead.
Well, you'll have my husband captivated at this point because he saw Bob Weir perform not that long ago.
Yeah, and he was a lovely guy.
Dead. Yeah, he knew him. He met him.
Yeah.
And when we actually met in New York, he had a band and played the Grateful Dead, so he was very sad to hear that Bob Weir had recently passed away. He was a fabulous musician, wasn't he?
He was, and he was such a nice man. One of those few celebrities you meet who are just so unaffected and sweet and honest and open and didn't have to go out of his way to talk to me, but he did. So I have very warm feelings about Bob Weir.
Where did you go after Dylan?
Well, the book was again a bestseller. It was a Sunday Times bestseller. It's in like 12 languages. Really, it's a very successful book, still is. But it was also quite stressful. Dealing with rock and roll people can be quite stressful. Dealing with Sony and agents and Los Angeles agents is really very difficult. So I thought, I want a holiday now. I want to take a break. I want to travel and do something that's kind of bucolic. I quite like golf. I'll write about golf. I'll write about professional golf. I'll spend 2 years covering the professional golf tour, and I'll go to all the major tournaments, and that will be very relaxing and calming after all these rock and roll, crazy rock and roll people. some of whom were taking drugs and just driving me crazy, I'll play golf. And that's what I did. And I wrote this book called The Wicked Game, which is my least successful book. And it was a complete disaster as a project. And it wasn't at all restful.
It wasn't restful. I was going to say, at least was it restful?
No.
And you weren't a golfer then, if you'd started to play golf to kind of get into the groove.
I was only interested in watching it on television.
Armchair golfer.
I was an armchair weekend watching the television. I had no interest in playing it, but I thought it was an interesting subject. And I found myself marching around golf tournaments, trying to talk to people like Arnold Palmer and Jack Nicklaus and Tiger Woods. And the book was a complete flop. It was of my 12 books, it's the one that really just died on its arse, as the Americans say.
What of the other ones that you've done are the ones that are particularly memorable for you? Not because they're a flop, hopefully.
They're all just like children. They're just such a major part of your life because they're all incredibly big projects. So they're years of work. Highest took 3 years. And I had villains coming to my flat trying to intimidate me. I was threatened by crooks, gangsters. It was quite unpleasant. I did a Paul McCartney biography and I was interviewing one of his family and he phoned Paul up in front of me and said, "Paul, I've got Howard Sounes here. Should I talk to him?" Paul said no. And he kicked me out in Liverpool. So that was memorable. But every one of those books is a big project and they're all intense. You give everything to them. And it's very hard to do that as you get older. It's very hard to summon the energy that it takes to dedicate yourself to a subject for 2 or 3 years. It takes a lot. And to be selfish enough to do it, not to be distracted by other things, is very difficult.
What drew you to the world's biggest heist, which was the Securitas robbery, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, it's because it was local. I grew up in southeast London and some of the money was found in a lock-up garage in a place called Welling. And I was born in Welling in 1965. And Welling, which is London Borough of Bexley on the outer skirts of southeast London, I was intrigued to think that this 12 million quid was found in a garage at Welling Corner. And Welling Corner was where I went as a little boy with my mother to go to the butchers and the fishmongers. And suddenly I realized it was part of this story. And so I thought, well, I've got to write about this because I know this world. I know the landscape. And I like the idea of it as a heist or a caper, a criminal caper. I like the idea of a gang of misfits, like in an Ealing comedy, gang of like bruisers and blokes and funny-looking blokes getting together and hatching a stupid plan and then getting all this money, more money than they can count, and then it all going wrong. I thought it was comical, really. It was a big project because it ended up being this very complicated Old Bailey trial that just took forever to unravel, and I had to stick with it until the end, and that was a bit of a pain.
You seem to have been drawn back over the years to crime, and I suppose I'm thinking of your book on Myra Hindley. You spent a good deal of time in the mind of Moore's murderer, Myra Hindley, who eventually in prison, I think, confessed to killing 5 children with her partner Ian Brady back in the 60s. What fascinated you about Myra and led to the decision to spend a good deal of time with her?
Well, 2 things. One, I always knew I was going to write a Moore's book because there are very few murder cases as interesting and weird as the Moore's murders. And Myra Hindley is a very interesting, complicated woman. And she always interested me. But I was making a TV program about it. That's how I started on that road. And I went to visit this woman who had been a prison jailer who had a relationship with Myra Hindley and helped her try to escape, try to break Hindley out of prison. And I rang the bell of this woman's bungalow near Saddleworth Moor where the bodies were found. And the bell rang. But it played this romantic tune. And I can't remember now, I think it was the theme from Love Story, something like that. And I had this moment of like, light bulb went off in my head. She's still in love with her. She's probably still in love with her. And I thought, how interesting that a woman can be in love with another woman who's a murderer decades and decades and decades after. And she's still somehow living in that world. And I thought, this has got to be a book. Whether she cooperates or not, it's a book. The story of this woman, prison officer who fell in love with a criminal and tried to get her out of prison and never got over that relationship. Those sort of intense psychological patterns, things that we all do in life. You fall in love with someone, maybe for the wrong reasons, but you can never quite get out of it mentally. That's interesting. I thought that was a different way of doing the Moore story. And that's my book, This Woman. And that's one of my more recent ones. So that was 5 or 6 years ago now.
Did she cooperate, Howard?
No, she never cooperated. But that's fine. Often people don't cooperate, but you have to work around that. And of course, the important thing is to remember when you're writing these kinds of books, you're in charge. I'm in charge, right? They're not in charge. I'm in charge. This is my book, right? So they're the subject, but they're not the boss. So if they say, oh, I don't want you to write this book, well, tough, right? Within the bounds of the law and what's not libeling people, I will decide what story I'm going to tell, and I will pick my way through it, and I will find other people who will tell me the story. But you're not going to tell me what I can do and what I can't do. And that goes for Paul McCartney or this woman in question. And I think the public often don't understand that. They think you have to have the permission of people to write about them. And of course you don't. Otherwise there wouldn't be journalism. There wouldn't be news reporting. You can report on anything as long as you tell the truth.
And of course, all your journalistic skills come into play with all of this, really. I mean, I'm sure all the things that you and I both learnt on Fleet Street as young reporters have been absolutely invaluable because you're investigating people's lives and looking into them. And a biography is so different to an autobiography.
Yeah.
It really is the story of somebody. It doesn't have to be with their blessing.
No.
What I think really stands out for me about the Myra story, and we'll all remember that mugshot of her with the peroxide hair under headlines of being evil and all this kind of thing. But here is this remarkable love story with somebody who works at the prison. But I didn't realise until we talked on a previous occasion about Myra Hindley that this woman did hatch an escape plan for Myra. It was quite something, wasn't it, the escape plan?
Well, it was really comical and kind of mad, but Myra Hindley was in Holloway prison. This is the early 70s, starting her life sentence. One of her jailers is this woman called Tricia Cairns, who's a former Carmelite nun who's become a prison officer. And they fall in love over a game of ping pong on the wing. And Hindley says to the Carmelite nun turned prison officer, they're never going to let me out, because the press hates me. I'm going to have to escape, and you're going to have to help me. And then this woman, Tricia Cairns, whose door I knocked on years later and played the romantic tune, she says, oh, okay, all right, what do you want to do then? And so they cook up this crazy plan whereby they're going to get hold of a set of prison keys, push them into bars of soap to make an imprint. They're going to make duplicate keys outside the prison, smuggle the duplicates back into the prison. Hindley's then going to let herself out of her cell, climb over the wall, beat Tricia on the other side, get a cab to Heathrow, next stop, Brazil. And this all sounds ridiculous. It is ridiculous, but they did try and do it. And they went through various stages of this plot, and they got another person involved to help them. And the police discover the plot, and they're all arrested. Hindley's already in prison, of course, but the others are convicted. And Tricia Cairns, the nun, goes to prison as a result and serves a prison sentence for it. So it's a quirky story. It has comical elements. And it has a period feel, 1970s London. It's a long time ago, and it's a bit weird. Also, it's a prison story. Prison stories are very interesting. Prison stories are always, I think, very compelling. We can all empathise with being in prison and wanting to get out of prison. Think of the Shawshank Redemption or something like that. And so this story has elements of that, I think, which I find very entertaining as a reader. And it's a good story to tell. It was a fun book to write, actually. But then, of course, it's also the way of talking about the murders.
Yeah.
The murders aren't fun, but it's a way of revealing Hindley's personality, because the woman who manipulated the nun also manipulated those poor children into getting into her car.
And what did you glean really about her as a woman beyond what we just knew from the trial and the press cuttings? What was the most interesting or shocking thing that you've realised about her?
I was impressed, actually, by the strength of her personality, her strength of will, her intelligence, and her ability to persuade people, clever, well-educated, law-abiding people, that somehow she was deserving of their help. So apart from this nun, the governor of the prison was won over to Hindley's side, famously Lord Longford, David Astor, who owned The Observer. These are all substantial people in society. And Hindley was able to persuade them by dint of her strength of personality and her intelligence, and frankly, lying, that somehow she was a misjudged person, that she was a redeemed woman. She believed in God now, and she regretted her past, and the media was against her, and the media was demonizing her. All complete nonsense. But she persuaded these people that this was the case. And a lot of people really, to this day, who knew Hindley in prison, really quite liked her. And I find that very interesting, and very unusual. She was a very unusual personality, Myra Hindley. And indeed, I'm now making another television program about her. And when you read her letters, she wrote these extremely detailed letters in tiny, tiny handwriting. Every word is perfectly formed. They're the letters of a maniac, actually, but a rather brilliant maniac.
You spend hours and hours interviewing people, researching what you're doing, travelling all over the world. But what is the actual writing process like when you sit down at your computer and put words on a page? Does it come easily to you, Howard?
Yeah, well, that's really when I'm happy. When I'm really happy is when I can finish the research, I can close the study door, and I can, for 6 months or a year, one of these books took a year to write, the McCartney book, because it was a big book. And then every day, Monday to Friday, you're on your own in your study and you're writing. And you're in silence. I'm totally happy. The hours just whiz by. Suddenly it's lunchtime. You have to have a sandwich. You listen to the radio for half an hour. Then you go back to your office. And I'm completely happy. I'm totally happy. And the longer it goes on, the happier I am. Months pass, seasons can pass, and I'm happy. And then if the phone rings or someone says, oh, we want you to do something or go to a party or something, it's a complete intrusion. You really want the world to go away.
I hope this podcast hasn't been an intrusion and you wanted me to go away. Perhaps you did. You've not said anything.
But I'm not writing a book at the moment.
Oh, so that's all right.
So, yeah, I'm just having a normal life. I'm going to the cinema. I'm looking to buy a flat. I'm talking to you. But if I had a book to write, I would live like a monk.
And do you still get time to read? Because you said about how much you love reading.
Yeah, I just read Ulysses by James Joyce over Christmas. I was an unhappy child and I read for comfort, and I've always read for comfort all my life. And I still do. It's the one thing I find makes me relax and calms me down.
Do you think it just takes you to another world? You know, when you're reading a story as a child, you can transport yourself somewhere else, I guess.
Yeah, when I was a kid, it was The Wind in the Willows, then it was Lord of the Rings, then it was War and Peace. It's an escape into another world, really. And I value books, and I like books. I like books in the house. I like a library. I find books civilized and comforting, and they remind me of the past, and they remind me of my mother, who was a great reader. And when I go into someone's house and there's no books, I just think it's like going into hell. They're barbarians. I don't understand how you can go into someone's house and there are no books, and they just have a big TV set on. It's like going into a bar. Where are the books?
I think that one of my greatest pleasures in life is going to somewhere like Dreamt Books, which I love, and buying a paperback. I do love a paperback. I know you're working on some new projects, but I also know you well enough to know that you play your cards very close to your chest. So I'm guessing we're going to have to wait and see, on your new projects.
Well, you can't talk about these things because if you have an idea, you've got to keep it to yourself. And that's true of a book and a TV thing. You've got to keep your powder dry. You've got to be the one who comes out with the revelation when you're ready. First lesson I ever learned as a journalist was don't talk about your stories until they're in the paper. And that's true of writing books.
Well, it's been fantastic having you here. We've kind of known each other on and off over the years, haven't we? And got to sit down and do our true crime podcast together.
Yeah, that was a great thing. And it's lovely to speak to you and to Martin Brunt.
Yeah, it was great. But thank you for coming in and giving us a real insight into your world as a writer. And I had no idea that you dreamt of being a writer as a little boy. So I'm really pleased that happened and you've been so successful at it.
Well, thank you. It's been really nice to talk about it. Thank you.
Good. You've been listening to biographer, journalist and author Howard Sounes. Most of his books, I think probably all of his books, are available to buy online. And I can promise you one thing, his style of writing and attention to detail will draw you in from the very first page. Download and subscribe to our series at convex.podbean.com or search The Convex Conversation on Spotify, Apple, wherever you listen to yours. I'll be back next week with designer Elizabeth Emanuel, subject of a recent Channel 5 documentary about the secrets behind creating Princess Diana's wedding dress. Join me then.